Winter settled uneasily across the Valley of Mexico. The fog of war still lingered over ruined towns and burned villages, but beyond the destruction, another force was already gathering strength. In Tlaxcala, Hernán Cortés prepared not merely for another campaign, but for the complete destruction of Tenochtitlán. He had escaped the city by luck, brutality, and desperation. He would not make the same mistake twice. This time, he intended to surround the Aztecs completely, to trap them, starve them, break them. And to do that, he needed control of the lake. The memory of the disastrous retreat during La Noche Triste remained fresh in the minds of every surviving Spaniard. The causeways had nearly become their graves. Aztec canoes had swarmed both sides relentlessly, turning every narrow crossing into a killing ground. Cortés understood now that no army could hold Tenochtitlan while the Aztecs still controlled Lake Texcoco. So he adapted. Under the supervision of his master shipbuilder, Martín López, work began in Tlaxcala on 13 brigantines, small but heavily armed sloops capable of carrying soldiers, artillery, and crossbowmen directly onto the lake. The project itself seemed almost impossible. Thousands of Tlaxcalans hauled timber through mountain passes and across rough terrain under constant supervision. Iron fittings, rigging, nails, sails, and artillery were carefully assembled piece by piece. Every component mattered. Every delay risked failure. Meanwhile, Cortés continued receiving reinforcements from Veracruz. Ships arriving from Spain brought desperately needed powder, weapons, and supplies. One vessel arrived carrying arms intended originally for the expedition of Panfilo de Narváez. Another brought 150 soldiers and 20 horses from the abandoned Panuco River settlement. Shortly afterward came 50 more soldiers and 7 horses under the command of Miguel Díez deAux, a conquistador remembered as the first mestizo born in the Americas. Even fortune itself seemed to strengthen Cortés. Far away in Jamaica, Governor Francisco de Garay continued sending expeditions toward Panuco long after the settlement there had collapsed. Ship after ship arrived, only to discover the original venture destroyed. Most simply joined Cortés instead. Every failed expedition became another reinforcement, another stroke of luck, another tightening link in the chain slowly closing around the Aztec Empire. By the day after Christmas in 1520, Cortés was ready to move. The brigantines, still disassembled, were carried toward Texcoco piece by piece, alongside enormous columns of soldiers and allies. More than 10,000 Tlaxcalan warriors accompanied him under the command of Chichimecatecutli, sent by Xicotencatl the Elder himself. The march toward Texcoco was long but largely unopposed. The empire was exhausted. Smallpox had ravaged entire regions. Tributary loyalties shifted constantly now, driven less by devotion than survival. When Cortés reached the outskirts of Texcoco, 7 local chieftains emerged to meet him. Their leader, they explained carefully, wished for friendship. Cortés accepted immediately, but friendship alone was never enough. Within days, he replaced the city's ruler with Ixtlilxóchitl II, son of Netzahualpili, newly baptized under the Spanish name Don Hernán Cortés. The message was unmistakable. Submission would be rewarded. Resistance punished severely. Texcoco soon became the center of Spanish operations against Tenochtitlan. And inside the Aztec capital, Yaotl watched the walls slowly close around them. The city had changed since the smallpox outbreak. Entire districts remained quieter than before. Many homes stood abandoned completely. The canals still functioned, the markets still operated, but the energy that had once defined Tenochtitlan felt diminished, fragile. Yaotl noticed it constantly during patrols. Too many widows, too many orphaned children, too many funeral fires. Even among the warriors, confidence had shifted into grim determination. They no longer believed the Spaniards could simply be expelled. Meanwhile, Cortés expanded his control steadily. After securing alliances with Chalco and Tlalmanalco, he sent captured Aztec prisoners back toward Cuauhtémoc, carrying a message. The surrounding towns now stood with Spain. The blockade was coming. Once Martín López and Chichimecatecutli finally delivered the remaining lumber and planks into Texcoco, construction of the brigantines accelerated rapidly. The vessels rose along the shoreline, one after another. 13 floating vessels, built specifically for conquest. Cuauhtémoc attempted repeated resistance throughout March of 1521, but his forces suffered defeats near Chalco and Huaxtepec. Worse still, another shipment of Spanish reinforcements arrived from overseas, carrying fresh arms and men. The imbalance continued to grow. Still, the Aztecs refused surrender. On April 6, Cortés gathered local caciques around Chalco and announced his intentions openly. He would blockade Mexico. He would bring peace through conquest. And the next day, he launched the brigantines into Lake Texcoco. Thousands of allied warriors gathered to witness it. The ships slid into the water beneath cheering from Spanish soldiers and uneasy fascination from native allies. For the first time, the lake belonged to the Spaniards. Soon after, Cortés marched towards Xochimilco with nearly 20,000 warriors from Chalco, Texcoco, Huejotzingo, and Tlaxcala. The fighting there proved fierce. Aztec resistance remained disciplined and relentless despite everything the empire had already endured. Street by street, canal by canal, the struggle intensified. By the time Cortés pushed northwestward again, he found towns like Coyoacán, Tacuba, Azcapotzalco, and Cuautitlán largely abandoned. The population had withdrawn inward, toward the capital, toward the final defense. Back in Texcoco, another danger emerged, a conspiracy. Antonio de Villafana, one of Cortés's own men, became implicated in a plot to murder him. Cortés acted immediately. Villafana was hanged publicly. Afterward, Cortés established a permanent personal guard of 6 soldiers under Antonio de Quiñones. Trust had become increasingly rare, fear increasingly necessary. The conquest had ceased pretending to be solely about conversion or diplomacy long ago. Now it openly consumed everything around it. By May 1521, the siege itself began. Cortés organized his forces carefully. He now commanded 84 horsemen, nearly 200 crossbowmen and arquebusiers, over 600 Spanish infantry, and tens of thousands of indigenous allies. Each brigantine carried sailors, musketeers, crossbowmen, artillery, and spare oars. The scale of the operation dwarfed anything previously attempted in Mesoamerica. Pedro de Alvarado marched toward Tacuba. Cristobal de Olid secured Coyoacán. Gonzalo de Sandoval moved against Ixtlapalapan, and Cortés himself commanded the brigantines directly upon the lake. The siege tightened, slowly, methodically, mercilessly. The first major clashes erupted around Chapultepec. Spanish forces attempted to sever Tenochtitlán's water supply by capturing the aqueducts feeding the city. The Aztecs resisted fiercely. At the Battle of Tlacopan, determined counterattacks halted the Spanish advance temporarily. Canoes swarmed the causeways, while warriors struck relentlessly from both land and water. But then the brigantines entered the fighting fully. When Cortés launched them from Texcoco, more than 1,000 Aztec canoes surged forward to intercept. For a moment, the lake seemed entirely filled with warriors. Then the wind shifted. A favorable breeze caught the Spanish sails suddenly, driving the brigantines directly into the Aztec fleets. Cannons thundered across the water. Canoes overturned. Men drowned beneath armored weight and panic. Yaotl witnessed much of the fighting from the causeways themselves. The brigantines terrified many warriors at first, not because they were invincible, but because they disrupted centuries of familiar warfare. The Aztecs adapted quickly, digging hidden pits beneath shallow lake waters and embedding sharpened stakes intended to destroy the Spanish vessels. Several brigantines were damaged, others nearly trapped. The Spanish horses also proved awkward and vulnerable upon the narrow causeways. Yet Cortés adapted constantly. Whenever the Aztecs countered one tactic, another followed. He ordered gaps opened within the causeways so brigantines could support infantry directly from the water. Soon, Aztec canoe attacks became far more dangerous. According to Diaz, the fighting began turning heavily in Spanish favor afterward. Still, the resistance never ceased. Day and night, the Aztecs attacked. Warriors launched raids against Spanish camps, while canoes attempted to sneak food and water into the starving city. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they died trying. One night, the Aztecs successfully ambushed 2 Spanish launches using concealed stakes and 30 hidden pirogues. Captains Juan de la Portilla and Pedro Barba were killed. Celebrations spread briefly through the city, but Cortés retaliated almost immediately. After capturing 2 Aztec chieftains and learning of another ambush, he laid a counter-trap using 6 brigantines. The result was devastating. Many Aztec warriors died, others were captured. Afterward, open supply missions across the lake became nearly impossible. The blockade tightened further. One by one, lakeside towns surrendered: Iztapalapa, Churubusco, Culhuacan, Mixquic. The ring around Tenochtitlán closed steadily. Inside the city, the fighting became increasingly desperate. American historian Charles Robinson would later describe the battle as one where neither side offered nor expected mercy. Yaatl understood why. The war had become personal for everyone involved. The Aztecs viewed the Spaniards as destroyers of their world. The Spaniards viewed the Aztecs as obstacles to conquest and wealth. And between them stood generations of allied tribes eager for revenge against Aztec domination. No quarter remained. On the feast day of St. John, Cuauhtémoc launched a massive, coordinated assault against all 3 Spanish camps simultaneously. The attack nearly succeeded. At Tlacopan, Pedro de Alvarado led a reckless cavalry charge across a gap in the causeway. For a brief moment, it appeared successful. Then Aztec canoes flooded the opening behind him. The Spaniards became trapped. Alvarado himself was wounded alongside several companions. 5 Spaniards were captured alive. From their positions, Spanish soldiers watched in horror as their comrades were dragged to the Great Temple and sacrificed publicly atop the pyramid. The drums echoed across the lake afterward. At night, the Spaniards prayed openly. "Oh, thanks be to God that they did not carry me off today to be sacrificed." Hatred deepened further, on both sides. Soon after, Cortés launched another direct assault toward the market district at Colhuacatonco. The attack nearly ended in disaster. In the chaos, Cortés neglected to secure one of the canals behind him. The Aztecs counterattacked immediately. Spanish formations collapsed briefly. Cortés himself was wounded and nearly captured alive. Only the sacrifice of Cristóbal de Oler and Cristóbal de Guzmán saved him. 65 Spaniards were taken prisoner during the fighting. The next morning, severed heads were hurled into Spanish camps. Others were sacrificed publicly atop the temples. For 10 nights, prisoners were executed before the city. The psychological warfare worked. Even hardened conquistadors felt shaken watching comrades dismembered and offered to the gods. The Aztecs shouted toward the Tlaxcalans afterward, "Eat the flesh of these Tules and your brothers, because we are sated with it." Despite everything, many indigenous allies began abandoning the Spanish camps. Thousands went home wounded or exhausted. Entire canoe fleets were destroyed. For a time, only a few hundred allies remained. Yet Cortés adapted again. Instead of merely advancing, he systematically destroyed every captured neighborhood. Buildings were torn down, rubble filled canals, causeways widened. The city itself became material for its own destruction. Tenochtitlan slowly transformed into a battlefield built for Spanish tactics instead of Aztec defense. and starvation spread. Inside the city, suffering became unimaginable. Food vanished first, then clean water. People drank brackish lake water despite disease. Dysentery spread rapidly. Families stripped leather from shields to boil and eat. Wood, grass, anything. Women offered even their children's clothing to the gods, leaving many children naked throughout the city. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. Yet Cuauhtémoc still refused surrender, and Yaotl continued fighting. Though exhaustion hollowed him physically, something stubborn remained alive inside him. Perhaps duty, perhaps rage, perhaps simply the inability to imagine another life beyond war. By August, the Spaniards finally entered the central districts of Tenochtitlán. Alvarado's forces reached the Tlatelolco marketplace first. Spanish banners rose atop temples while sacred structures burned. Smoke filled the sky for days. Still, the Aztecs resisted. Even now they continued traditional ceremonies. One warrior, Tlapaltecatl Opochtsin, was dressed in sacred costume and sent against the Spaniards bearing ceremonial darts dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. The Spaniards hesitated at first, unnerved by the spectacle. The Aztecs interpreted this as a sign from the gods. But signs could no longer feed the starving, could no longer stop cannon fire, could no longer rebuild what had already been broken. Then came the storm. A tornado formed over Tlatelolco during the final days of battle, moving across the basin and out over the lake. Europeans witnessing it later described it as the first tornado they had ever seen in the Americas. To many Aztecs, it felt like an omen, perhaps an ending, perhaps judgment, perhaps both. Soon afterward, Cuauhtémoc finally attempted escape. With family, gold, and retainers loaded into 50 pirogues, he fled across the lake beneath cover of chaos. But Sandoval's brigantines intercepted them. The final emperor of the Aztecs was captured and brought before Cortés. Tenochtitlan surrendered on August 13, 1521. The Aztec Empire fell. What followed horrified even some Spaniards. The city had become a graveyard. Bodies floated through canals or lay unburied in collapsed streets. Most Aztec nobility were dead. Survivors consisted largely of women and children. Yet the slaughter continued. Tlaxcalan allies rampaged through the city, seeking revenge for generations of sacrifice and oppression. Homes were looted, women raped and killed, children slaughtered. Thousands died after the surrender itself. Even Cortés struggled to restrain them. He later admitted they had more trouble controlling their allies than fighting the enemy. Centuries of hatred exploded all at once, and there was no mercy left anywhere in the city. 2 days prior to Aztec surrender, Guadalupe carefully made her way to the causeway where she knew Yaotl was stationed. She walked around for hours, being careful not to be noticed by enemy forces, but needing confirmation to the final chapter in this tragic tale she called her life. She went up and down streets near the causeway until she found him, laying on the floor near a merchant shop no more than 100 yards away from the causeway exit. Yaotl had multiple stab wounds in his torso region, but the fatal wound appeared across his neck, a deep cut from a Spanish sword causing severe blood loss. Guadalupe took a moment and stared at Yaotl's lifeless body. She found herself unable to cry, not because she did not love Yaotl, but she had no more tears left to spare. The tragedy of her life had come full circle with Yaotl's death, and her thoughts quickly adapted to the reality of her present circumstances. She had plenty of experience of being on the losing end of a battle in 16th century Mesoamerica. The consequences of that fate were one she wished not to experience again. So she would need to make her way further west, away from Tlaxcala, Tenochtitlan, and soon-to-be Spanish rule. She would make her way to the western coast, so she may survive what was to come. And in doing so, she hoped to live long enough to cast revenge on the one person she felt in her heart most responsible for these events.